Okay. Hello, I'm so sorry about that. I had some technical difficulties. My computer stopped connecting to Twitch, um, but I think that I figured it out. So I'm just going to go ahead and get started. Um, if you didn't hear me before, unfortunately I'm under the weather, so I might have to pause just to give my voice a break for a second or blow my nose. Um, so I'm really sorry about my Squidward sounding voice today, but I won't try to let it deter me too much. Okay, let's get started. So the first thing is asking about how ion concentrations affect neuron function. Thank you guys so much. You're all so sweet. Much of our early understanding of neuron function was based on studies of the squid's giant axon. Squids move through the water by contracting the muscles of the mantle. This movement compresses water inside the mantle and forces it out the siphon. A squid can change the direction of movement by directing the flow from the siphon either forward or backward, relative to its head or anterior end. So this is just how they move, how it flows. Thank you all in the chat for being so nice. As always, you're the best. So, just with that in mind, for number one, it's asking, in which direction would the squid move if water flows from the siphon, if water flow from the siphon were directed toward the head end of the organism? So as it's set up here, the squid would move backwards. Or towards the tail end of it. And so, just to give you the flip side, conversely, if the siphon were directed backward so that it pointed toward the tail, the squid would move forward. Moves the squid forward. What do you mean by opposite? If you could just clarify that in the chat. Okay, and then let's move this up a little bit. Number two, when the squid are startled or in danger, they can simultaneously contract all muscles of the mantle to forcefully jet water out of the siphon and escape rapidly. Assume the mantle of the squid is 30 centimeters in length, about 12 inches, and the distance from the brain to the mantle opening is another 8 centimeters, which is about 3 inches. For all muscles of the mantle to contract simultaneously, a nerve signal sent from the brain must reach all parts of the mantle at the same time. On the diagram of the squid above, draw 3 neurons. Assume all of them originate from the ganglion indicated and the ganglion is stimulated by action of a single motor neuron from the brain. Neuron 1 innervates the mantle muscles nearest the brain. Neuron 2 innervates the muscles in the midregion of the mantle, and neuron 3 innervates the muscles at the tail end of the mantle. So I'm just going to move this up and kind of zoom in here a little bit. I know that was like a lot of words. I'm not very good at just the reading and understanding, and hopefully the diagram will help. So neuron 1, they said, is closest. And the size that I'm drawing them does matter, but I'm not going to talk about that until a little bit later. So just keep the size of them in mind. This is neuron 2. And then finally neuron 3. And we'll just be referring to this figure as we move forward to the next couple of questions. So in invertebrates, like as the squid, how must the nervous system design be modified to allow both the muscles nearest the brain and those farthest from it to contract simultaneously? Modify your drawing to indicate any necessary changes in the size or structure of the 3 neurons that would be required, and explain your reasoning. So I already drew the neurons according to the size for this specific answer, so we don't need to go back and change anything. That first neuron, as we saw, was pretty small. The second neuron was thicker, but it also was shorter than neuron 3, which is the thickest and longest. So invertebrates, as a squid, do not contain myelinated nerves. Unlike us, this lack of myelination doesn't really help with the rate of response time. So we know that myelination in our own neurons, we have those nodes of Ranvier, and the action potential generated through a impulse of a neuron will kind of jump through those nodes, and it actually increases the efficiency of time for that neuron to travel, so it makes it a lot faster. Invertebrates actually don't have myelinated nerves, and so that speed, instead of being modulated through myelination, speed is modulated by changes in the size of the different axons and neurons. And so that's why we saw that neuron that was traveling the furthest to the end of the squid. That was actually the thickest, because the increase of diameter will increase the rate of that action potential, or that impulse, which is what we want. We want it to be fast. We don't want it to be slow. Sorry, I'm just going to mute myself for 1 second. I'm going to get a drink of water really quick. Thank you. Okay, so now moving on to 3, we're going to be looking at these ion concentrations. Number 3 says, researchers discovered that they could remove these giant axons of the squid. With some skill, these axons could be maintained outside the body if held in ion solutions of the same concentration as the squid's extracellular fluids. If stimulated with a microelectrode, these isolated axons would generate action potentials. By recording the potential difference between an electrode and the axon versus one in the fluid bathing the axon, researchers could also record the potential difference at rest and any change in potential difference that occurred as a nerve impulse, action potential was generated. So, oh geez, I just sound so much like Squidward. Right down here, we're seeing the ion concentrations for intra and extracellular fluids of the squid. So that's this whole table, and this is for humans. We'll see the squid has potassium, sodium, chlorine, and calcium, and we're focusing mostly on potassium and sodium for ourselves. So we're going to be using these numbers in the next couple of questions to answer and solve some problems using the Nernst equation. Thank you, Snowy Ash. Oh, Snowy Ash is kind of a dark name, but I also like it. So this is the Nernst equation. This 58 right here is a constant number, so that's just what we're going to be using throughout all of the calculations. So if you're ever like, where did that 58 come from, just know that it's a constant that is found in the equation itself. So we have this 58 divided by Z. Z is the ion valence. We get that valence from the periodic table. So because we'll mainly be dealing with potassium and sodium, those are in the first column of the periodic table that tell us that it has an ion valence of 1. So that's mainly what we'll be concerning ourselves with today. So we have that times the log of the concentrations of ions out over the concentrations of ions in. So using this equation, we're going to calculate the equilibrium potential for potassium and sodium in the human, which if we remember right here, we're going to be using these numbers in our calculations. So for K, for potassium, we have that 58 megavolts over 1 ion valence times the log of out over in, and we saw out to be 5 and intracellular to be 140. This is equal to negative 84 megavolts. For sodium, we have that same constant, and we have that same ion valence. And we're going to multiply that by the log of ion concentration out over ion concentration in. For sodium, that was 150 extracellular over 15 intracellular. And that is equal to a positive 58 millivolts. Similarly, we're going to use these numbers to do the same for the squid. We're going to be looking at potassium and sodium. So these two numbers right here, and just make sure to pay attention to intracellular and extracellular. Oh, keep scrolling too far. So for potassium, we have 58 over 1 times the log of 20 extracellular over 400 intracellular, and that is negative 75.5 millivolts. And then for sodium, finally 58 over 1 times the log of 440 extracellular over 50 intracellular. That is equal to positive 54.8. Okay. I am going to put the Google form in the chat. And also, just so you guys know, this is a relatively, this is a longer um, worksheet today, so if I don't get through all of it, just remember that all of the um, keys will be posted. And I did check up on the YouTube channel, and I've updated everything now. The YouTube channel should be up to date with all of the live streams in case you would like to rewatch. So, number 4. In a typical neuron, which ion has the greatest influence on the membrane potential at rest? In other words, flux of which ion contributes the most to the resting potential? And explain why this occurs. So, at rest, almost all of the, let's say, at rest, almost all of the sodium ion channels are closed. So they don't really contribute. However, there are potassium channels. There are potassium channels that are open. They're called potassium leak channels. And this allows for the flow of ions down its concentration gradient. And I know this can kind of get confusing when it comes to membrane potential, because we know at rest, inside is more negative than outside, and we think about potassium leak channels, like why would they want to go from the inside to the outside? Like that's just creating a more negative inside, but that's because it's not flowing in the direction of sodium. As we know, because the sodium channels are closed and they are outside the cell, there's a larger concentration of them outside than inside the cell, but there's no sodium channels open. Because there's more potassium inside than outside, flowing down its concentration gradient solely means flowing down a concentration of high potassium to low potassium. So just, I would think of separating the two. It's kind of hard to think about them together, but easier to think, okay, there's a lot of potassium inside the cell, therefore these leak channels that flow down its concentration gradient are going to want to go from in to out because there's less on the outside. So that's why potassium is more of a driving force. It increases the intermembrane negativity versus, the difference in charge of positive and negative in and outside the cell. And so the answer to this question is that potassium is the ion which contributes the most to the resting membrane potential. All right, number 5. In calculating the resting and action potential of the axon, we generally don't worry about the concentration differences of calcium or chloride ions. Explain why this is so. So the concentration differences are set up by active transport. Oh, excuse me, I have to sneeze. Sorry. Sorry, 1 second. Oh, sorry. There was like 3 sneezes in a row. I feel like it's just combined allergies because my allergies get really bad. Anyway, okay. The concentration differences are set up by active transport of the ions across the neuron membranes, which is the same for all concentration differences. But we are not concerned with calcium or chloride I'll say this, we are or chloride, because the neuron membrane is impermeable to these under normal conditions. Yeah, seriously, every season 2 is getting more gnarly. But I heard that eating local honey helps with allergies. I still haven't done that though, so here I am. Alright, the last question on this page, and we'll follow it up on the last page. I mean, the page, next page, oh my gosh. We're working on 6, doesn't matter. So, what effects would the following changes an extracellular K plus concentration be likely to have on the resting memory potential of neurons in a human? So we're going to just look back at that Nernst equation and use it, but refer to it in terms of how can changing these ion concentrations, either lessening them or adding to them, how does that change the memory potential? How does that change the cell? So we're going to do that 58 over 1 again, times the log of, instead of 5 over 140, we're going to do 2 over 140. And that equals negative 107. So what this does, when we're changing the concentration from 5 to 2, this actually would hyperpolarize the cell. And we know that when oh, no apologies. It's a bit sadly pollen and honey. Oh no. Well, sad to hear that. Still buy local honey, I guess. Promote local honey, whether or not it helps with allergies. And then to answer your question about concentration of potassium being more or less negative, so I'm just going to draw this out. I think it helps. Sorry, there was a lot of pages. So if this is, a neuron, this is extracellular, intracellular, oh my gosh, I can't spell. And we have this is potassium, and this is sodium, this blue. So naturally, inside the cell is more negative and outside the cell is more positive. So we generally have a higher concentration of Na outside the cell. And what that question was talking about is that usually we have, these gates, let's say that these are Na gates. These are always closed. They're usually closed when it's at rest. So there's no flow of any sodium in or out. There's none. However, because there's more potassium inside the cell, and we have these things that are called potassium leak channels, it's not active transport, but because it's going from high concentration, it's going down its concentration gradient, which means high to low concentration. There's more potassium inside or higher concentration than outside, so these leak channels allow for potassium to flow down its concentration gradient, and as a result, that is what makes the inside more negative than the outside. Does that make sense? Oh, Linda. Sorry, you guys. I always do this with the pictures. So, these guys right here, these potassium, can move out through their leak channels, but these blue right here can't. They're not permitted to pass. Their channels are closed. Okay, awesome. I'm really happy that helps. Okay, so just going back to 6A, that's the one that we were just working on. So changing the concentration from 5 to 2 will hyperpolarize the cell. And you know how we talk about this period in between action potentials where we see, the spike, but then we have this little point right here where there's no ability for an action potential to happen again because it's hyperpolarized. It's not at resting and it's not close to having that all or none response. And yes, absolutely, I can put the form in again. So basically, when the cell is hyperpolarized, it just makes it a lot harder for an action potential to proceed again. Okay. And then 6B, now we're looking at a change in extracellular potassium from 5 millimoles to 20. So we're now like increasing it a bunch. Let's just do that math. And so we know that the normal potassium equilibrium normally is around negative 90. And what this tells us is that changing that concentration to a much higher concentration would most likely change the equilibrium potential enough to bring it above threshold. So instead of 6A, where we saw a hyperpolarization of the cells, we saw it harder to generate an action potential. Here, because the level is at the level of where an action potential would be generated all the time, then all of the neurons in the body would fire and death would result. So, yeah, a fun fact, death by lethal injection involves sedatives and muscle relaxants, but it also combines like a high concentration and intravenous delivery of high concentration potassium. So it just really messes your whole body up. I mean, it's a lethal injection. But still, it's just interesting that we know at the microscopic level how these ions work and how much they can change how our bodies function. So next down here, what we're seeing is this is actually for you guys. So there's not anything in the key. I could definitely draw this out for you if you guys want me to. I kind of did. Actually, let's just do it. Let's just do it. Why not? Why not? So I'm just gonna delete this. So it's similar to a couple of days ago where we were labeling the heart. Now we're gonna label the parts of the neuron, the ions, and the gates. So we have not like the best at alright. There we got that. I hope this is not the best drawing, but that is okay. So these little guys here are dendrites. They receive information, they link up with the axon terminals of the neuron. So if we have another neuron here, we had axon terminals, and this little fluid space in between is a synapse. Dendrites, I'm going to draw a nucleus in here, but this is the cell body. This is what we would call the post-synaptic. Oh, I always do this. Synaptic neuron. Because it is post this guy, it's receiving the information, so this would be the pre-synaptic neuron. And then right here, yeah, we have the synapse right there, the fluid-like space. These are myelin sheath, made up of Schwann cells and R cells, specifically. And so these are those nodes of rate V that I was talking about. And so when an action potential goes down, just to show, because the neurotransmitters are all connected with here, it'll kind of jump, 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 and then pass it on. And that's why that includes faster transmission. But in squids and invertebrates, as we saw, a way to kind of get that myelin sheath is the larger diameter. And so when it comes to potassium, sodium, those voltage-gated channels, if we were to just look at a closer view, this is the axon. We're looking at a closer view of the axon. We saw that sodium was higher outside the cell, and potassium was higher inside. We have voltage-gated ion channels throughout that membrane. Some of them are potassium leak channels or potassium gates. Some of them are sodium gates / channels. And we also have potassium gates and channels. They're not pivotal to that action potential or the threshold, but they are a important part of neurotransmission, especially in muscle cells. So that's just kind of a rundown. I know that the key won't give you one, but there are a lot of diagrams with great pictures of neurons. I'm sure there's a bunch in your textbook if you need any more clarification. All right. Okay. Just 1 second again. I'm sorry, folks. I know I keep having to pause. I just need to take care of my nose real fast. Okay. Use your understanding of how action potentials are generated and propagated to answer the following questions. All cells maintain an ionic and therefore electrical potential difference across their membranes. In most cells, this potential difference is between -50 and -100 millivolts. That is, the inside of the cells is more negative than the outside by 50 to 100. Although all cells in the body maintain this potential difference across the membranes, only certain cells, for example neurons, are capable of generating action potentials. How is this potential difference across the cell membrane generated? So, sodium, potassium pumps pump Na out and K plus in. Remember, I know this is counterintuitive about the K plus in, but remember those leak channels are just about down the concentration gradient. Sodium and potassium pumps are different, so they can pump against concentration gradients. For every 3 sodium pumped out, 2 potassium are pumped in. So what this does is that the inside of the cell contains fewer positively charged ions, and so the difference in ion distribution is measured as voltage, potential difference across the cell membrane. For the squid axon, the potential difference is actually -70, which is what we calculated above. So I'm just going to write the difference in distribution is measured as voltage or potential difference. Okay, B. What characteristics of membranes allow cells to concentrate or exclude ions? Permeable ions, like sodium, potassium. Oh, sorry. Totally read my own explanation wrong. So the cell membranes are selectively permeable. I was like, wait, they usually don't cross without a channel. So ions like sodium and potassium cannot diffuse across. And must be actively transported or diffuse through specific ion channels. So as we said, the ratio of sodium to potassium also affects the concentration of the ions in the cells. I'm not going to write that just because we kind of talked about that in the last question. My iPad keeps freaking out. Okay. C. What is it about neurons that make their properties different from those of the other cells? In other words, what enables nerve cells to produce action potentials? All cells generate a potential difference across their membrane, so I just want to make sure we all know that. So all cells but only nerve cells have voltage-gated ion channels that open and close in response to changes in the potential difference in the membrane. Okay, D. How is an action potential started and propagated? There is a figure in your textbook that shows us more in depth, but then I just want to let you know that responses that I'm writing down is at a single site on the axon. So this happens down the axon, but this is just one little part of it. depolarization in the neuron membrane opens some of the sodium gates, and those ions diffuse into the axon. When the potential difference at that site reaches threshold potential, the Na plus activation gates at the site open, and so I'm going to say open some. That's really important because when the threshold potential is reached, then all of the sodium gates are open. It's also important to note that the potassium gates at this point are still closed. Then the potential reaches plus 30 megavolts. Remember, the threshold potential is negative 55. And this is looking at that squid axon. It'll reach this. So we reach our threshold, all the sodium gates open, they rush in, and when the sodium gates open, so we see this kind of leveling off, and we have threshold, this is all the sodium gates open. And then it reaches that positive 50, and that's when the potassium gates open. So we have Na plus gates closed. And potassium gates open. At this point, the site is repolarized. So we're going to call this repolarization. This is depolarization. And then when the potential difference reaches negative 70, I just want to write this out. So we have negative 55 threshold. Then cell reaches negative 70 millivolts, and potassium gates close. So as we see here, both sodium and potassium gates are closed at this period. So there's no possibility of any action potential to be generated again. This is what is called the refractory period. When they're inactivated, so I'm going to say specifically with sodium, is it activated? The gates close. The cell is insensitive to depolarization. It cannot be depolarized. It can't make another action potential. And so what this does is it will limit the number of action potentials that are generated per unit time. And so the refractory period helps explain why action potentials normal travel only in one direction on the axon, why they're not in a bunch of different places, is because it's a very stepwise process. I think we have time to answer maybe one or two more. But once again, there is just a few more questions after this, so if you do have the chance, I would highly recommend you check out the key once it's posted. Does generating an action potential require any direct or indirect energy input? If so, when and where is the energy used? So, other than energy required to generate a depolarizing stimulus, no direct energy input is required to generate an action potential. So no direct. However, energy is required indirectly to fuel the action of the sodium-potassium pumps. Oh. And this generates potential difference across membrane. Okay, so I know that we have not finished. I'm sorry. The next question is a little bit more in depth, so I don't think that I'll have time to finish it here. I'm going to put the Google form in just one more time, and I'm going to call this good. Does anybody have any questions before I let you go? I hope you guys don't feel rushed or anything. Of course, if you have questions, please email me. Awesome. Thank you guys so much. I will definitely see you next week. I definitely hope I'll feel better than I do now and don't have to sniff into the mic for you all to hear. But thank you guys so much for showing up. I really appreciate it. I hope you guys have a great week. Thank you guys for your support, and I will see you soon. All right, bye.